Welcome to lecture number 56. This is topic 6.2, Westward Expansion and Economic Development. This is the first of two westward expansion lectures, and like the title suggests, we're going to only focus on economic development. In the next lecture, we're going to focus on social and cultural development. Since the topic covers people moving out west, the theme is migration and settlement. The learning objective is explain the causes and effects of the settlement of the West from 1877 to 1898. The first of four learning objectives says, improvements in mechanization helped agricultural production increase substantially and contributed to declines in food prices. The first improvement that we're talking about is not actually an improvement in the farming process. Instead, it is an improvement in moving the harvested crops from farms to market. The rise of the railroads and the construction of a transcontinental railroad that connects the different parts of the United States makes food crops more widely available, leading to a decline in their prices. The first transcontinental railroad was completed on May 10, 1869, when the two construction crews joined tracks at Promontory Point, Utah. One end of the construction started in Sacramento, built by the Central Pacific Railroad Company, and the other end started in Council Bluffs, Iowa, constructed by the Union Pacific Railroad. The picture in the top left is the meeting of those two railroads. Largely absent from the picture are Chinese migrant workers that helped construct the Central Pacific Line. They were not allowed to be seen in the celebration picture. Developments from earlier in the 1800s and the use of machinery like the mechanized reaper, seed drill, and steel plow increased crop production on farms. Commercial farms that can afford the larger equipment buy up more land and in turn yield larger harvests. Sodbusters were farmers in the Great Plains. They had to adopt dry farming techniques as a result of the lower precipitation levels in the plains. They lobbied the state and federal governments for irrigation projects to better store and divert water to be used for farming. The 100th degree meridian or line of longitude is a key dividing line for where rainfall begins to decrease. The line of longitude runs straight down the middle of the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and the middle of Texas. Beyond this line, the more arid climates of the West become more common. These new farming techniques were meant to get to the bottom layer of the soil where there were more nutrients to help grow crops. This is going to be relevant later in the 20th century because decades of these farming techniques are going to completely deplete the soil, turning it into a sandy consistency after it's lost all of its nutrients, and results in the Dust Bowl of the 1920s and 30s. To reiterate the main part of the key concept, food prices were starting to decline because of an increase in supply of crops. The increase of their availability through the construction of railroads and higher yields as a result of irrigation projects and the new farming techniques increased the supply of crops in the market. Whenever there is more of something, the value of it goes down. Because farmers spent a lot of money in all their new equipment and moving out west, the prices that their crops yield are not enough to make up for their costs. Their natural response is to plant more crops for the next harvest, which actually will yield even lower and lower prices. They will get stuck in this loop where they're only hurting themselves by continuing to farm more. The next key concept says many farmers responded to increasing consolidation in agricultural markets and their dependence on the evolving railroad system by creating local and regional cooperative organizations. That means that farmers organize themselves in response to the weak position they found themselves in. The first of these organizations is the National Grange of Patrons of Husbandry in 1868. The Grange, as it's called for short, created cooperatives or co-ops to protect farmers from railroads and middlemen. This means that farmers would pool all of their crops and have the greatest leverage when negotiating railroad rates. Railroads had a habit of taking as much money from farmers as they could. Railroad companies knew that the farmers were reliant on the railroads to transport their goods to market, and there was no other alternative mode of transport. Therefore, they artificially raised prices for farmers to ship crops on short-haul trips where there was no other competition for the railroad. In response, the Grange and its co-ops built grain elevators and storehouses to store crops and negotiate better rates when shipping larger shipments. Previously, railroads owned the storehouses too, so it was a way to loosen the control that railroad companies had gained over farmers. The Grange also lobbied for the governments to regulate the railroads and the rates that they were charging farmers. In the Supreme Court case Munn v. Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that the government can regulate industries of central infrastructure, like the railroads, through Congress's power to regulate the interstate commerce outlined in Article 1. The other group formed in this time is the Farmers Alliance. They started in the Southeast and are mostly political and economically active. They penned the Okolala Platform in 1890, in which they state their support for government regulation of railroads, direct election of senators, the increase of the money supply, and various other things that would help farmers. These were progressive ideas that had the intent of helping farmers first and foremost. Basic tenets of the Okolala Platform are later adopted by other movements like the Populist Party, which grew out of the Farmers Alliance. The third key concept says, following the Civil War, government subsidies for transportation and communication systems helped open new markets in North America. The transcontinental railroad lines have been covered in earlier lectures and even in earlier key concepts of this lecture. Their construction was only possible with the help and subsidies that the federal government offered companies to build it. The law that set out these subsidies was passed in the midst of the Civil War. The railroads helped open new markets and fundamentally changed the way some industries operated. The cattle industry raised cattle, specifically Texas Longhorns, and drove the cattle north to cities in Kansas and Missouri that had access to rail lines that connected to larger cities like Chicago, Illinois. Cattle drives grew increasingly difficult as homesteaders that moved into the paths of the drives would put up barbed wire fences to keep the cattle from trampling over their farms. At the same time that the drives were getting harder, railroads were expanding to areas closer to the Texas ranches where the cattle were raised. Another way in which the government became involved was by giving similar subsidies to telegraph companies. Telegraph lines were constructed parallel to new lines of railroad. The growth of the telegraph was simultaneous to the growth of the railroad industry. The new invention allowed various parts of the country to communicate almost instantaneously through the use of electricity and the new Morse code. Separate from government incentives, the railroad companies developed the use of time zones as a way to coordinate the various train schedules and increase efficiency. The Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern time zones that we use in the continental United States today all arose because of the need for railroads to be more efficient and to allow people to know when their train was coming so that they would not miss it. Finally, the last key concept says, the building of transcontinental railroads, the discovery of mineral resources, and government policies promoted economic growth and created new communities and centers of commercial activity. The California gold rush that took place in California in 1848 and 1849 was the major discovery and that created a boom in population in the West. The Comstock lode of Nevada, discovered around the same time, was still active in mining out the silver ore that had been the largest found in the U.S. The amount of silver to be extracted was unlike anything seen before. Also unique to this silver deposit, the ore was found in a large mass that could easily be excavated at one time, whereas normally silver ore is normally found in long, thin veins across the rock layers. Similar discoveries of mineral resources continued through the rest of the 19th century, and every time that there is a new discovery, it leads to the creation of a boomtown. Boomtowns arose next to the area where the mineral deposits were found. As soon as those mineral deposits were depleted, they became ghost towns because people deserted them in search of new deposits. Virginia City was the corresponding boomtown to the Comstock lode, and it was as complete as any other city or town in the United States. It included schools, churches, and proper infrastructure. The mines were a central part to the town's economy, but the boom towns that were able to diversify their business and services usually avoided the fate of becoming ghost towns. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in South Dakota happened in the early 1870s. It led to further displacement of the Sioux with the gold rush reaching its peak in 1876. The deposits were so large that it made up to 10% of the world's gold supply for the next 125 years. There was a problem though. The Black Hills had already been given to the Sioux in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, after they had been dispossessed from other areas. At first, it's individual prospectors going into the Black Hills and illegally mining the area. The Sioux asked the federal government to uphold their end of the treaty and kick those people out and prevent them from going into the Black Hills. The federal government does an act, and Congress unilaterally votes in 1877 to seize the Black Hills from the Sioux. After about 150 years of legal disputes with the United States, U.S. courts have decided that the U.S. violated the original terms of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and the Sioux were granted monetary compensation. The tribe has not accepted the money, as they still contest part of the settlement, so the money continues to accrue interest. Today, the sum of money that they are due is up to $1 billion. Alright, finally for the recap. Agricultural production increases, and it leads to a drop in prices, negatively affecting the farmers that are moving out west. Organizations for farmers like the Grange and Farmers Alliance are created as a response of these negative circumstances. The U.S. government heavily subsidized transportation and communication expansion. And finally, mineral resources drove economic growth where white settlers had not been before. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.